When a wealthy woman named Evelyn notices a young girl, Grace, sitting outside her mansion night after night, she's drawn into a story of love, loss, and haunting secrets. As Evelyn learns the girl is searching for her brother, a former gardener with dreams cut short by a mysterious accident, she uncovers a shocking truth about her own late husband's dark past. Will Evelyn's guilt push Grace further away, or can they find peace and healing through an unexpected bond? What happens when forgiveness feels impossible? Find out in this powerful tale of resilience and redemption. The rain pelted down in relentless waves, drenching the pavement and hammering against the towering iron gates of Evelyn Gardner's mansion. She'd barely noticed the weather these days, more preoccupied with high-stakes meetings and extravagant events that filled her schedule. But tonight, as her sleek black car turned toward her grand entrance, her eyes caught sight of something, or rather, someone. There, sitting quietly on the rain-soaked stone by her gate, was a young girl, no older than 9, shivering under a thin, ragged jacket. Evelyn's driver slowed, seeing the girl's pitiful state, but Evelyn waved him forward. She muttered something about strays as the girl's haunted eyes lifted for just a second, meeting her gaze before Evelyn turned away. By the time her car door shut, Evelyn had put the sight behind her. Little did she know that girl's presence wasn't a one-time thing. For the next 3 nights, rain or not, the girl appeared again, always quiet, always alone. What in the world is that child doing here? Evelyn wondered, irritation prickling at her. It wasn't her concern. She had enough to manage without someone else's troubles lingering outside her gates. But the girl's persistence gnawed at her. On the 5th evening, Evelyn stopped on her way into the house, muttering to her assistant, "Find out who that child belongs to." Yet, her assistant returned empty-handed. The child spoke to no one, and no one seemed to know her. Frustrated, Evelyn returned to her busy routine, brushing off the strange incident until one evening changed everything. The rain had given way to a chilly autumn night, and the girl was there again, sitting by the gate as if waiting for someone. Evelyn's routine had continued as usual, but tonight something stirred within her as she caught sight of that frail, solitary figure under the dim streetlight. The girl's persistence was unnerving. Evelyn, frustrated by her own growing curiosity, decided she would confront the child herself. She strode down the long drive, her heels tapping on the wet stones, until she reached the iron gate. The girl looked up, her dark, round eyes wide but cautious. Up close, Evelyn could see how thin she was, skin drawn tight over her small face, hands reddened from the cold. "Who are you, and what are you doing here every night?" Evelyn demanded, folding her arms as she stood tall over the girl. The child hesitated, her gaze darting between Evelyn and the ground as though weighing her words carefully. "I'm waiting," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Waiting for what?" Evelyn asked, exasperation tinged with a hint of something softer, something she hadn't felt in years. But the girl only looked away, hugging her tattered jacket tighter around her. Evelyn's patience was thinning. "Who are you waiting for?" she repeated, sharper now. But the girl didn't respond. Something in her eyes, a look that was both hopeful and deeply sad, took Evelyn aback. Evelyn turned back to the house, unsettled but resolute. She had done her part. But as she walked away, the girl's faint voice drifted behind her. "Did you know Danny?" the girl asked. Evelyn froze. That name pulled her out of her world of polished surfaces and social graces, down to something old and buried. Danny had been one of the gardeners, a boy from the neighborhood who had started working at her estate 2 years before. He'd been kind and always willing to go above and beyond, though Evelyn barely knew him. He had left mysteriously months ago. Some story about an accident, she thought. But what did this child have to do with him? She spun around. "Yes, I remember Danny. Why are you asking me about him?" The girl's gaze fell to the cracked photo she held in her hand. Evelyn could barely make it out, but she saw enough. It was a picture of Danny. This child must be his sister. The realization stirred something in Evelyn, a tug at her conscience she hadn't felt in years. The girl looked up at her, voice small but clear. "He told me that if I ever needed him, I could find him here. He said he'd come find me if I waited." The words struck Evelyn, catching her off guard. She looked down at the girl, and for the first time she saw not just a nuisance, but a child clinging to a brother who would never come. Danny had been in a hit-and-run accident one rainy night on his way home. It hadn't affected Evelyn much then, but now, standing here in the presence of this girl who seemed to believe he was still coming back, Evelyn felt a sharp pang of guilt. She sighed, torn between dismissing the girl again and an impulse she couldn't fully understand. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Grace," the girl replied, shivering as she spoke. Evelyn looked at her for a moment longer, and without thinking, she made a quick decision. "Come inside," she said abruptly. "You can't stay out here in the cold." Grace looked up at her with a glimmer of surprise but didn't move. Evelyn softened her tone. "I knew Danny. You can come inside just for tonight." Grace hesitated, but at last she followed Evelyn into the mansion, her small, wet footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. Evelyn watched as the girl looked around, her eyes wide at the grand space she found herself in. The vast hall, with its high ceilings and gleaming chandeliers, was a stark contrast to anything Grace had likely ever seen. "Sit here," Evelyn instructed, pointing to a plush chair in the sitting room. She told the housekeeper to fetch warm clothes and a hot drink for the girl. As Grace sat holding the cup tightly in her small hands, Evelyn felt a strange tug of protectiveness. She had no children of her own, no family she truly cared for, and yet here was this girl, alone and clinging to the last memory of her brother. As the night went on, Evelyn felt compelled to know more. "Did Danny look after you?" Grace nodded, eyes clouded with grief. "He took care of everything after Mom and Dad left. He worked so hard," she whispered, voice choked with emotion. "He said he'd always come home, but he never did." Evelyn's chest tightened. She tried to brush off the pang of guilt, but the girl's words hit too close to home. Evelyn had known about Danny's accident, of course. She'd even made a small donation to the hospital without much thought. But hearing about the girl's loneliness, her trust in her brother, stirred a new sense of duty Evelyn didn't want to feel. As the evening drew to a close, Grace grew drowsy in the warmth, her eyelids heavy. Evelyn arranged for a guest room, deciding Grace would stay the night, just this one night. But as Evelyn was about to retire for the night, her assistant appeared, holding a worn letter he'd found among her late husband's things while clearing out an old study. "Ma'am, this was addressed to you. We found it hidden in a drawer," he said, handing it to her. Curiosity piqued, Evelyn opened it. As her eyes moved down the page, her breath caught. The words were from her husband. He was confessing to a hit-and-run accident, describing it as a mistake he could never forgive himself for, a guilt he carried alone. Evelyn's heart hammered as she read the description. It had been a young man on a rainy night near the same road Danny took every day. A horrifying realization washed over her. Her husband had been the one behind Danny's accident. He'd hidden it all these years, and now she was left with the consequences of his secret, sitting here in her mansion. Evelyn's heart raced as the weight of her late husband's words sank in. She clutched the letter, feeling as if it might burn through her hand. Danny, that kind, hard-working young man who had so faithfully tended her gardens. It had been her husband who stole his life, and here was his little sister, trusting Evelyn to provide comfort she barely knew how to give. Her mind whirled with a mix of guilt and anger, and above all, an urgent need to do something. But what? Her husband had kept this secret from her, from everyone, and she now held it like a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every passing moment. The next morning, she found Grace sitting at the breakfast table, looking somewhat out of place in a soft robe Evelyn had lent her. The girl's hair was neatly combed, and though still pale, her face had gained a bit of color. Seeing her there, so vulnerable yet resilient, Evelyn felt the familiar tug of guilt sharpen into determination. She had to make amends. She just didn't yet know how. "Grace," she began, keeping her voice steady, "you told me you don't have anyone else. Is there anyone who checks on you or where you live?" Grace shook her head slowly, looking down. "Danny and I didn't have anyone. Since he didn't come back, I just stayed where we lived. But he said to come here if I ever needed him," she added, her voice barely a whisper. Those words twisted something deeper within Evelyn. Danny had trusted her. Even indirectly, even unknowingly, he had sent Grace here. It wasn't just an accident that this child had shown up at her gate. She felt she owed it to him to make things right, whatever that meant. For the next few days, Grace stayed at the mansion, slowly warming to the staff, who began to treat her with the kind of gentle care Evelyn hadn't expected. One morning, as Evelyn passed by Grace's room, she saw the girl sitting on the floor with a few crayons, scribbling a rough sketch of a small house, with what looked like a garden outside. She watched for a moment before clearing her throat softly. "Grace," she began, stepping into the room. The girl looked up, her eyes still reflecting the same quiet hope that had once haunted Evelyn but now grounded her. "How would you feel about coming with me somewhere today?" Grace's eyebrows rose. She gave a small nod, curious but wary. They drove to the small, run-down apartment Grace had been living in, a place Evelyn had imagined as bleak, but which, in reality, was worse than she'd feared. Paint peeled from the walls, the carpets were thin and dirty, and there was barely any furniture. Grace's things were scattered in a tiny corner, where she'd clearly done her best to create a small, makeshift home. Evelyn's throat tightened as she took in the surroundings, her guilt now replaced with a simmering resolve. "You've been living here? Alone?" Evelyn asked softly. Grace nodded, not meeting Evelyn's eyes. "It's okay," she said, her voice timid. "I was okay. Danny would come if he could." Evelyn's chest ached. The truth was a silent roar within her, threatening to break free, but she held it back. For now, she needed to focus on Grace, on finding a way to give her what she had lost. She arranged for Grace's things to be packed up and brought back to the mansion. That night, Evelyn found herself pacing the halls, thinking about the hidden truth she'd uncovered. She knew she couldn't hide it forever, but how could she possibly tell Grace? And what would happen to her afterward? The next morning, as Grace played outside with a small ball one of the housekeepers had given her, Evelyn found herself talking quietly with her assistant, Henry, about her discovery. He was an old friend of the family, a man who'd been with them through countless seasons of life, and Evelyn trusted him in ways she trusted few others. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but with a tremor of concern. "This kind of secret doesn't stay quiet." "I know," Evelyn replied, her voice almost a whisper. "But if I tell her the truth, she'll hate me, Henry, and rightfully so." Henry put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She deserves to know, Evelyn. But maybe she also deserves to see that there's more to you than your husband's mistakes." Evelyn looked at him, absorbing his word. She knew what she had to do, though it filled her with dread. That evening, she sat Grace down in the sitting room. The girl looked up at her with trust Evelyn could barely bring herself to face. "Grace," she began, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I need to tell you something. Something very hard." The girl's eyes widened slightly, but she waited quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. "Your brother, the night he didn't come home," Evelyn said, taking a shaky breath. "It wasn't an accident like we thought. My husband, he was the one who hit him with his car. He kept it a secret. From me, from everyone." The room fell silent, the words hanging heavy between them. Grace's face crumpled as she processed what Evelyn was saying, her expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and deep, cutting pain. "No!" Grace's voice trembled, a mixture of anger and despair. "He wouldn't. Your husband, he wouldn't." "I'm so sorry, Grace," Evelyn whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. "I didn't know, but that doesn't make it right. I should have been there. I should have helped him. And you. I can't undo what happened, but if you'll let me, I'll do everything I can to make this right." Grace looked away, her small frame trembling. Evelyn reached out a hand, but Grace pulled back, the pain too raw, too fresh. Evelyn didn't force her, only sat quietly, allowing Grace the space to grapple with this new, terrible truth. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She knew she had fractured any bond she'd managed to build with Grace, and perhaps irreparably. Yet she also knew she had made the right choice, no matter how painful it was. In the days that followed, Grace withdrew into a silent, guarded shell. She refused to speak more than a few words at a time, her gaze distant, and her presence a shadow in the grand halls of Evelyn's mansion. The air between them grew colder, laden with the heavy truth that Evelyn had dared to reveal. Evelyn, for her part, watched helplessly, unsure how to mend what she'd broken. She had always believed herself a strong, self-reliant woman, but nothing had prepared her for this, the silence of a child whose world she had torn apart. She wanted to reach out, to comfort, but each attempt only seemed to push Grace further away. Evelyn wondered if there was anything she could do to bridge the chasm between them, or if Grace would one day leave her home for good. One morning, as Evelyn passed the girl's room, she noticed Grace standing by the window, staring down at the mansion's vast, manicured garden. Her face softened just slightly, as if caught in a memory. "What are you looking at?" Evelyn asked gently, her voice low to avoid startling her. Grace hesitated, her voice barely audible. "Danny. He used to talk about how he wanted to make something beautiful, a place full of flowers and trees. He said one day, when he'd saved enough, he'd plant a garden just like this." Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of it. Danny had been young, with so much hope, and now all that was left of his dreams was a memory shared with his little sister. "Would you like to help me plant something here?" Evelyn asked softly. "Something just for him?" Grace looked at her, skeptical but curious. "Why would you do that?" "Because he deserves it, and you deserve it," Evelyn replied, her tone firm, though her heart beat faster, unsure how Grace would react. For a moment, Grace simply stared at her, unblinking, her face unreadable. Then, as if deciding something silently, she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said, her voice steady, almost resolute. "But it has to be a real garden, not just flowers in a fancy pattern." Evelyn nodded, feeling a flicker of hope stir within her. "We'll make it real, just as he would have wanted." And so the next week was spent ordering seeds, finding tools, and planting the garden with Grace. They chose roses for beauty, lavender for peace, and strong, towering trees that would grow for years to come. The staff watched in awe as Evelyn herself rolled up her sleeves and dug into the earth beside Grace, planting each seed, watering each row. The mansion grounds had never seen such transformation, and neither had Evelyn. She found herself laughing for the first time in years, even when her hands ached and her clothes were stained with soil. Little by little, Grace's walls seemed to weaken. She would share stories of Danny while they worked, describing the things he loved and the dreams he had confided in her. In these quiet moments, Evelyn felt a closeness to the brother and sister she had barely known. She realized that she was growing something not just in the garden, but in her heart, a connection, a bond forged by loss and longing. But Grace's grief was a river that ran deep, and Evelyn knew better than to expect a full reconciliation. Their relationship was fragile, still bound by pain. Yet one evening, as they finished planting the last row of lavender, Grace surprised Evelyn by slipping her small hand into hers. "Danny would have liked this," she said, her voice soft, a hint of gratitude shining in her dark eyes. "Thank you for not forgetting him." Evelyn felt a lump in her throat as she returned Grace's gentle squeeze. "I'll never forget him, Grace. I promise you that." Spring bloomed in vibrant colors across the garden, and with it, a sense of quiet peace settled over the mansion. Evelyn continued to care for Grace, respecting her independence but always keeping a warm meal, a safe place, and an attentive ear for the girl whenever she needed it. Years passed, and the garden became a flourishing sanctuary, a tribute to Danny's memory and Grace's resilience. Though Evelyn's late husband's actions had brought darkness into their lives, the garden stood as a reminder that even in the face of pain, something beautiful could still grow. One afternoon, as Evelyn watched Grace walking among the trees and flowers, now taller and stronger than the small, lost child who had first sat by her gate, she felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. She'd kept her promise, honoring Danny's memory and, in turn, finding a family she never expected. If you found strength in this story, I hope you'll share it with others. Let's keep the memory of resilience and love alive, just like we did here in this garden. Subscribe for more stories, and join me for the next one that's already waiting for you.